Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry podcast. My name is Robert Bryce. This podcast is about energy, power, innovation, and because we talk about those topics, we inevitably talk about politics. And today, I'm really happy to welcome my friend Joyashree Roy, who's joining us from Bangkok. I've known Joyashree for several years. She is one of the world's leading economists on issues of pollution and on climate change and the politics and economics of that. And Joyashree, we've known each other, as I said, for, 5 or 6 years now, and you really facilitated the trip that I took to India along with my wife, Lauren, and Tyson Culver, back in 2016, which was critical in the making of the film Juice, which is now out. So I could introduce you, and you have a long CV and a long resume. I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you introduce yourself to our listeners in case they don't know who you are, or as though you've just met someone and you're going on a trip together and they want you to know who you are, if you don't mind?
Okay, so I'm Joyashree Roy. Currently, I'm the Bangabandhu Chair Professor in Energy Economics and Energy, Environment, and Climate Change program at Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok, Thailand.
Before we started recording, I was talking to you about your background. So I know that you went from your resume, you went to Lady Dean College in Shillong in Meghalaya, which is the northeasternmost part of India, which is barely even connected to India. But tell me about where you grew up. I don't know any of your background, your history, your family. If you don't mind, just tell me a little bit about that and how you ended up at Lady Dean College, which sounds like a Lady Dean Girls College, which sounds like a pretty remarkable place.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, I was born and brought up in the quaint town, hill station in foothills of Himalayas. It is actually 3,000 feet above sea level and full of pine trees, rhododendron, plum, pears, a fantastic walkable town at that time. So in
And that and
our
is that in Meghalaya?
yeah. Meghalaya means the land of cloud. So it's really a land of cloud. Anytime you are walking on the street, you'll see that cloud is passing by you. So it was a completely different life there. So on our way to school, shopping, marketing, we used to meet all the citizens of the city and almost knew each other. So it was famous for living, education, tourism, and waterfalls here and there. So hydroelectricity was the major source of electricity at that time when we were growing up. But for cooking and space heating, it was firewood, coal, kerosene, which were the major sources, even until 1980s. And after that came liquefied petroleum gas for cooking, and then electric cooking, but not for all. So, to avoid cold, we used to wear woolens of fashion, as we knew using coal in space heating in closed rooms is not good for health.
Sure.
So, we had wooden houses with interesting local material for insulation. When I look back, that was indeed a great building technology, but I think now the skill is lost. But yeah, it was great town.
And the skill is lost, meaning what? I'm sorry?
Because at that time the local carpenters used to have very high skill and they used to build these houses. So if you ask them, they never gone to the schools or anything, but it was a traditional knowledge,
I
and they
see.
built so beautiful houses, but that was not properly documented. And after that, the concrete and cement came in, and so the ugly buildings started popping up here and there. So that's why I know the skill is lost.
Sure. And so
And
and
but
so
I
how far
remember.
is it's so far how far is that town from Shillong, which is I guess the major city in Meghalaya?
I was in Shillong,
Oh,
so
you
that
weren't
was the
okay.
town. Yeah, that was the town where. So Shillong was the capital of Meghalaya. But if you think of Assam, which was the original bigger state, which got divided later on. But Assam tea, right, which is famous. So
Sure.
Shillong was the capital of Assam. And Shillong was also known as Scotland of the East. So it was really, really beautiful. And so the college, it's a nostalgia. If I talk of Ledican Girls College, it was a pioneering college for women at that time. It started in 1935, I mean, well before the independence of India. And it was truly a cosmopolitan college, and we used to get girls from all over India. And as I said, this town was really very good for education. So people used to come from different parts of India and for their college and schooling. We used to get a whole bunch of people from different parts of India with different cultural diversity. So it was a completely different reality where we grew up. And so, yeah, it's
Really
a real,
separate from
yeah,
the overwhelming majority of India,
yeah,
right? I mean, now you're
mhm,
almost completely separated with
yeah,
Bangladesh in the middle. You just have that
yeah.
small isthmus connecting Meghalaya with the rest of India. I
Mhm.
looked up Lady Dean College, and this is on their website. They talk about the school, and reading it now, it seems kind of anachronistic, right? The way they talk about it, even. But it says the institution shall be
Yeah,
equipped with the necessary facilities to make our women useful and
yes,
helpful members of the society, capable of taking part in activities related to the moral, social, intellectual, physical, and economic development of the community at large.
yeah,
And
it is true.
it seems almost quaint now to read something like that, but I mean, we're talking almost 100 years ago. This is a major change in
Yeah.
India, or even I think it would really even be for the US, just a college university just for women.
Yeah, but also, very important to understand is that northeastern part of India, I mean, the British missionary came there long back. And so the education in that part of India is above 90% always, So the education was a major priority for the families there.
And that was part of the legacy of the British colonial rule then.
In
Or
that
is that,
part of the
or do you attribute it to that? I don't want to assume that, but was that part of
No,
it?
I would not.
Oh,
I would
okay.
not. But I would say that okay, in very remote parts of India where they went, they did establish schools, which were I mean taught in English. But I would say that India has a very long cultural history of yeah, having the education and training, and so real learning, no, Nalanda University, and so that was long back where which is in Bihar now. So it was even I mean during 500 AD. So I mean these are very old institutions we do have.
Sure. Well, and then I saw you got your master's in economics at Northeastern Hill University, which was also in Shillong.
Mhm.
And then you went to Kolkata and you got your doctorate at Kolkata, at Jadavpur, where we visited
Mhm.
in Kolkata in 1991. So, how did you end up in Kolkata then from Shillong?
Oh, well, actually, if you think, then regionally, I'm a Bengali. So, and Calcutta is in Bengal. So, from that point of view, it's the same region. So, I had my maternal and paternal houses in Calcutta. And also, I mean, that was the nearest city in the eastern part of India, which was a mega city with all different kind of facilities. And Jadavpur University is one of the top universities in India. So when I thought that I'll be doing my PhD, of course, the choice was for Jadavpur University. So I came there for doing my PhD, but my brothers were also in the engineering school in Jadavpur University at that time. So it was kind of so my other family members were there, and so we moved there, and we had our own house also there. So yeah, it made sense to come back to
So,
Calcutta.
so now tell me about your family, and I want to just tell me about your siblings, and then I want you to talk about your mother, because in Juice you
Mm,
talked about your own mother, and in the interviews we've talked about that, how what a great influence she had on you.
yeah.
So, I mean, how many siblings do you have?
Oh, we are six.
Uh-huh.
I'm the youngest. I have four brothers and one elder sister to me. And my mother, she grew up in Calcutta, and she went to school and completed her class 10th grade. And then she got married at 17. And then she went to her husband's house. And that was at that time, India was undivided. So Bangladesh and West Bengal were the same country, right? So they went to that part, eastern part of Bengal. But then later on, again, when India got divided, she came back with my father to Shillong, and they got settled there because my father was with the central government intelligence department. So they settled in Shillong. And then after that, when I came to do my PhD in Jadavpur. So my mother and my sister and I, we all moved to Calcutta. So yeah, that's it.
But from what the way you've spoken of her, she was a tremendous influence on you as one
Okay. So
as
if
someone who
you
was just
think,
a, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. So if you talk of the influence, then it has a very different story because I lost my father when I was 2 years old. Because and that was also not a natural death, right? So he was assassinated by the insurgents at that time. He was in intelligence department, and so my mother, with six of us, and she was at the age of 35 at that time, so she had to bring us up, and with the ideal that she wanted us to be good citizens and she wanted us to be educated. That was her primary motivation. And so because she was educated at that time, so she got a job in a school to teach, and which was closer to our home, so she could take care of her children as well as she could do her job, and with that, with the dignity, she could bring us up. So only thing which we learned from childhood is that you need to have self confidence, and for that you need education, and that's the only thing which can make you to do something in your life. And if you really want to do something in your life, and that's the only thing you should be aiming for. So with all these words, we grew up in such a way that and the kind of hardship we saw she used to do for bringing us up and to take care of our education, our health, our food, our nutrition, everything, that so we were a very united family. We always was with her, and so we together wanted to do something, so so that really had a very interesting influence in all of us, I would say.
Remarkable, really. I mean, your mother that I mean that your mother would be a teacher, and you mentioned the importance of having electricity in your house when you grew up, right? That
Yeah,
was, I mean, the combination of those things really set you on a path, which leads
yeah,
to my first question to kind of bring us up to date. So in 2007, you are still a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as I understand it, right? So you were part of that group that won the Nobel Peace Prize, or at least were in 2007. Growing up in Shillong, did you ever ever imagine in your wildest dreams that you'd have some? I mean, I know it's
no.
not given necessarily directly to you, right? It's not yours to say,
Yeah,
"Oh, I carry this
yeah,
around,"
but
you know.
then yeah, we were part of it because we got the certificate. So we got we 2000 scientists were part of the whole, and we had to take a decision what we will do with the money. So we decided to put the money for providing fellowship to the aspiring scientists who want to do research and pursue their PhD. So it goes to all the students all over the world. So yeah, I mean, I never, I could never imagine. But I mean, even after when this was announced, so I remember one of the newspapers in India, they asked me that, how did you end up with doing research on climate change and environment? So I said, this is really due to my Shillong connection, because I grew up with the nature and I knew what value it had in my life and in our life from that point of view. And I really feel it even within my heart, even today, that what it means to grow up in that kind of rich natural biodiversity and with more human value. So this is something very important to me.
Is your mother still alive?
Say, no, I lost her 4 years back.
So she was able to see you be part of this Nobel Prize. That must have been pretty moment for you, a good moment for
Yeah,
you. What?
and
Yeah.
and she got the certificate framed and hung in her wall, and whoever
Oh,
used to come,
that.
she used to show that.
Oh, you had to enjoy that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But did you ever dream when you were at Lady Dean at Lady Keene Girls College in Shillong that you would end up in that kind of a situation, or even then now having a doctorate and living in Bangkok? And I mean, you've traveled the world really from a very remote, well, relatively remote part of India, but still, I mean, it's a pretty remarkable journey you've had.
Yeah. Well, I feel, that I don't think that, I mean, we are so myopic. We just do not know what will be happening next day, right? Whoever imagined that pandemic will change our lifestyle, right? So,
Yeah.
so it's like, so we are myopic from that point of view. But one thing I learned from my life is that uh, you need to know that what really advances human life, right? So it's the knowledge, it's the training, it's the skill building, it's your introspection, as well as your connection and collective community feeling. All these things build up. So your social capital, your human capital, and knowledge capital, I think, are the three basic things which really takes you forward. So from that point of view, I mean, I always feel even today that I do not know where I'll end up, but I know that I'm on the right path, which it can put me on the frontiers of this course in human civilization, and so that I can maybe even if one of 7 billion share also, if I contribute, that would be my life's satisfaction.
That's great. Well, so you live in Bangkok now. So that, I mean, we've looked back and at where you've been, and it's just it's a pretty remarkable journey, right? To be raised by a single mom and to make that journey from what is really a small town in India. I mean, would be still considered a small town in India to Nobel Prize now in Bangkok. Tell me about what you see in Bangkok and kind of I mean, our focus has been on energy and climate and where we go from here. How does the approach to these issues in Thailand differ from what you've been familiar with in India? What's the difference there?
Yeah, it's interesting, if you really want to compare the energy development or the energy or environmental issues between the two countries or even two cities or whatever, one need to look into multiple things, and then only one can compare, right? So for me, what I would like to see is that, okay, so what is the resource endowment of the two countries, how they are different. So these are things which I look into, right? And then I look into that, okay, so what is the access to technology in both the countries, and what is the capacity in both the countries, what is the size of the country. So all these things do matter. So from that point of view, the first striking thing which I came when I came to Bangkok was that if you think of the resource, I mean, in Thailand, it's the natural gas and oil is 80% of their resource. And
And
so
when you
that
say 80% of the resource, what do you're saying
energy
that?
resource.
So their consumption or their ability
80%
to. Okay.
from natural gas and oil. And if you look into their power generation, 60% is from gas,
Wow.
and 19% is only from coal, and the rest of it is in renewable, etc.
I see.
And the other thing is that if you look into India, then it's the coal which dominates, right? So it just the reverse in number, right? So if you think so, from that point of view, India is coal dependent and Thailand is gas dependent, you can say. So
Right.
this makes a major difference when I look at the environment and climate change. And the other thing is that if you look into the per capita consumption of electricity, then in Thailand, it is almost just the double of India's per capita consumption. And but in both the regions, the Australia is the main coal exporter.
Sure.
So both the countries import coal from Australia. And but if you look into the conversion technology, and then how the resource is also related to it, this is very interesting because in Thailand, bioenergy is a very important resource, and their technology and their indigenous technology development in that, along with their policy, is remarkable. And you can see the cassava plantation and all these different varieties, Jatrova and many other, right? So they are really progressing very fast with a target on bioenergy. But if you look into India's bioenergy policy, that was a disaster. It was not a success story. There are several reasons, but it was not a success story. But from another point of view, India has nuclear power and nuclear energy, power for energy, and wind. But these two are not in Thailand because wind is not feasible and nuclear they don't have. And if you now think in terms of the modern microgrid, based on solar and renewables. So this is again, Thailand is progressing faster than in India, I would say, in terms of their own technology development, etc. But
and can I interrupt you there? Because why is that? I mean, you have cultural differences. Bangkok has a higher per capita income, and that, of course, is related directly to energy consumption. But what is I mean, we can talk about what the particulars of biofuels and the rest of it. But is there something that is difference in government or different in governance? Why is Thailand able to do, for instance, microgrids, which I think would potentially have a great opportunity in India? What do you see as the difference?
Yeah, no, because they have a higher level of R&D and R&D investment, and also they have more technically trained people, and they are higher income country. So higher means high middle income country, and so they have more investment in that. So that is something which is very important. And but also interestingly, if you look into the energy efficiency, India has made a great progress in that. And so that is also very interesting to compare. But structurally, both the economies have, service sector share is more than 50% in both the economies. But Thailand has very high export of the manufacturing, electronics, and also agricultural product. It's a huge exporter. So much of variety in agriculture and horticulture production. So that's a major exporter. India also has very fertile land, but then it has more people to feed. So it's less exporting compared to Thailand. And I would say that biotechnology has progressed a lot in Thailand.
Huh.
They have invested in this R&D for very, very long time. And so from that point of view, if you look into the irrigation technology, because that's also another very energy using technology, right? So in India, it's mostly groundwater based, so there is more electricity consumption. But in Thailand, that is more surface water based. And they have a higher irrigation, but then it's more efficient irrigation system they have. So, I mean, these are very interesting comparisons which you can actually make. But size wise, if you see, then it's interesting, right? So, population is in Thailand is 0.069 billion, and in India, 1.3 billion. And India's population is growing now at 1% per annum, and in Thailand it is 0.3% per annum. And Thailand has very low unemployment rate.
Right.
Forget about the pandemic, but then before that, so it was very low. And so it's more a happening place. And very interestingly, their king, the earlier king, made Thailand a kind of concept of sufficiency economy. And what he did, he asked every province what is the resource endowment they feel they can use locally, and what can be their speciality they can build on it. And every province came out to be their special skill and the resource. They identified themselves, and King funded those. And so now they have OTOP, a marketing chain which markets all these products. And you will not believe how good quality and fantastic they are, and what kind of diversity. So people did not move out of the rural areas. Actually, they made the rural area very rich from that point of view. Of course, there is poverty here also, because there is a relative poverty, but it's much less. But I would say that that's a fantastic concept which I think I have learned. Gandhi talked about this long back in 1935, 40s
Sure.
in India, but it did not take up. But here
Right.
we could make it.
Well, so let's jump back, because you mentioned the issue of coal, and the U.S. The latest data from BP suggests that, or showed that the U.S. coal consumption dropped 19% last year. I looked it up. I think the coal use in the U.S. is now at the same level it was in 1965, and it's going to drop another 20% or so this year is the projection. So coal is clearly on the way out in the United States and being replaced by gas, but it's not the case in India. And India and Modi himself and others have said, well, this is going to stick around for a long time. So why is that? I mean, it's easy, and what you see in the U.S. and Europe, oh, coal is bad, but is there a path forward for India that doesn't include coal in the next couple of decades?
This is interesting. So, um, if you, my research shows that, I mean, because in India, I would say that in between 80s, so after the first oil shock in 1973, India took a position to dig out more oil and gas. So they really did that for 20 years, I would say. And at that time, gas and oil consumption was increasing in India, and that was domestic oil. So that really replaced the imported oil. But then the reserve was declining. So India started importing oil, and that really put a burden on the foreign exchange for India. So what happened was, at that time, Australia was competing with exporting coal with cheaper. And so India already had the technology to, generate power from coal, and you can start a plant in 3 to 5 years. So it's a very short gestation period. So that really, there was a huge rising demand. So to meet this quick demand, and given that imported coal was cheaper, so the coal-based power station continued in India, right? So that was a major thing, I would say, which really happened. But even now, today, if you look into this, then you will see that it's still, um, I mean, although 59% of installed capacity is from coal in India now, but the generation wise, it is still 76% of generation comes from coal, right?
Sure.
And although share of hydroelectricity, which was much higher, which declined, so hydroelectricity, investment in hydroelectricity was going down in between, because people thought that hydroelectricity is creating environmental problem. So that was another kind of social environmental issue people looked at, but did not look into coal for another environmental issue. So this is something, I think, more myopic vision, which really led to these things. Now, what I see is that even if I do all different kind of very optimistic projection also, and scenario building for India. So even if I say that India is going to follow the global need for emission reduction, and that's why they are going to change their energy usage pattern. But even with all optimistic numbers and investment need, I do see that coal will continue till 2050. And with the current, programs which is now on on board with the government, with that, 50% will still be coal in 2050 unless you do differently. So how differently you can do? So we did another analysis where we wanted to see that if gas is taken as a transition fuel, and if it replaces coal, then what it means. So very interestingly, we found two very important results, I would say. One is that if you replace gas with for coal, and you still allow, because given the expenditure and the import bill, you need to still allow some coal still there. And so if you really allow the ultra supercritical plants only, still in 2050, we can see that still 20% will be coal capacity from ultra and super critical
so just to interrupt, because I just want everybody who's listening to understand. So there are three different types of coal plants. There's called subcritical, which is the overwhelming majority of coal plants in the world are subcritical. That is, that they are built at relatively, we call it a standard design. Beyond that, you go to supercritical and ultra supercritical, and those plants operate at higher temperature and higher pressure, and therefore they get, I believe the term is, greater enthalpic efficiency. So you get more, you wring more watt hours out of each pound or ounce or gram of coal or ton of coal, and therefore less emissions per unit of output. So, but they're more expensive to build. They're, and some of the and the technology is not as widely available, and it just is more expensive. So India and other countries have been building subcritical plants. But let me shift that to not just talk about India, because what is clear from the latest data from BP and elsewhere is that the world is really being split in terms of power generation. And, my focus and a lot of your focus lately has been on electricity, and that the global electricity market is being split between the relatively wealthy countries, the developed world, and really Asia and South Asian countries, where they're adopting and building more coal-fired capacity. So it's really a schism in terms of a schism, or a bifurcation, I guess would be the better word. between the fuel choices being made for power generation in the West versus in Asia. And from what you just said, it sounds like that bifurcation is going to continue simply because countries are going to build the power gen sources and generation plants that make sense for them now. Is that square with what you know?
Yeah, that's happening. But then also, now I would say that, yes, that's the reason. But then the other question is that because, say, for example, still Germany has 36% of their generation from coal, and China has 60% from coal, right? So, and as you said, in US it is 19%. So
Japan is building new coal-fired power plants.
New coal plant, right? So the question is, for India, we need more generation now because there is still unmet demand for electricity, right? So it's India's per capita electricity consumption is 3 times less than the world average. So definitely with rising population and with 200 million poor people, the demand for electricity is going to grow anyway. So, I mean, you cannot stop, because I'll come to that later. But so what I'm just trying to say is that, so demand is going to grow. So you cannot stop the current coal plants like many other countries. What they are trying to do, they are stopping, right? And they're bringing in renewable and they are stopping the coal. But in India, that's not an option. Any the solar plant also comes, that will be additional to what we have now. So even if we are not building any more, still till 2050, some of this capacity will need to continue, so because just to meet the total demand. So from that point of view, although in 2050, given all the numbers, even if we see that 50% of the installed capacity will be from solar, wind, and hydro, but the generation will be much less, only 21%, because of the efficiency. Given that, if we assume that the efficiency is not going to improve too much, then at least that will be the case. So coal will be needed. Otherwise, you replace them by gas, but that also you cannot do everything, because you cannot depend 100% on the imported fuel, because
and that's more and that's more expensive.
Exactly. So these are the issues, these are the real critical issues which one has to address scientifically, and then try to see that what. But okay, but I would say that there is another discussion, which actually I would say from 2007 onwards, in IPCC reports, you will see that there has been a discussion that no new coal plant can be allowed to continue, not prescribing, but then say that it cannot be recommended to continue without carbon capture and storage. So then you make them zero carbon, right? So India's, if you look into the national the NDC, right, nationally determined contribution in Paris, in that document also India talks about the carbon capture and storage. But the technology has, in many countries like China, is doing tremendous progress in that, in terms of demonstration projects, and in Europe they are doing a tremendous progress in that. But in India, not even a single demonstration project has started. So I feel that if India decides to stay with coal, then there is no way out but to invest in carbon capture and storage. Otherwise,
Sure, but that's an economic question, right? And this brings me back to the I mean, this is always the trade-off, right? And that's one of the key, I think, the friction points when it comes to the Paris Agreement or any of the projections about needs for overall CO2 emissions reductions is that countries like India, like Thailand, they're going to make decisions that are in their own self-interest, right? And that the politicians get elected and stay in office by making people's lives better. And one of the ways they do that is through cheap electricity. So, I mean, isn't that one of the key challenges, though? And it's in terms of the longer term progress for developing countries is that tension, right, between relatively cheap energy, and coal fits that description, and this other the other desires, the other discussions about trying to limit emissions. And as we talked about, that is are they going to choose economy first or emissions?
No, I would say that you cannot make a choice of either or, because if there is more emission, then there is going to be an indirect impact. And so there will be more cost on the economy in terms of damages, etc. So it's like, that do I eat cheap burger or do I eat healthy food? So, or do I end up giving more medical bill or do I go for preventive health care, right? So it's like that. So from that point of view, I would say that to me, environmental resource is a natural capital. So if we can take care of that capital, then of course the economic and the man-made capital, which is a power plant which we are building, we need to balance the natural capital and the man-made capital. And this whole thing really makes the development sustainable, right? So in the long term, and also in the short term in terms of reduced damage cost. So from that point of view, I don't think there is a conflict between um, environment and economy, but it is how we have made our economic policies. Have we made it artificially distortionary incentive? That is something very important, right? So is your oily, unhealthy food cheap in the market, and is healthy fruit is costly in the market, then I would say that market incentive need to change if I want my people to lead a healthy life.
Well,
So
then,
from
well,
that
then let me,
point,
well, then let me
yeah.
let me stop you there, because that, I mean, what I'm hearing you say when I'm first, you're saying they don't have to be separate. So, a lot of people in the U.S. have been talking about. There's a lot of people who are saying, well, a carbon tax. Well, we'll implement a carbon tax. What do you think about that? You're an economist.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Would India or Thailand or Bangladesh, would they willingly sign on to a carbon tax?
Whether signing on is a different, that's a political, that's a international politics, right?
Right,
But
but that's
if you
the rub. I mean,
yeah,
that's
no,
the
but let
hard
me tell
part.
you,
No.
but let me tell you one interesting thing. India, it was from, I'm forgetting exactly the date, but I think it is from 2007, 2008, 9 maybe, or 2010 exactly. Since when India actually imposed a carbon tax, not called tax, but in a very old public economics books, you will find cess, 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 right? So carbon cess we had. So coal cess. So in India, we do have this public policy instrument called cess. So we have education cess, we have water cess, like that. So we had a coal cess, which meant that any, say for example, iron and steel industry, if they have to buy from Coal India 100 tons of coal, they need to pay a coal cess of 400 rupees per ton. And 400 rupees is, say, 50 cents per ton, right? So that's something which is imposed by the government on as a coal cess. So that's a tax, right? So it's exactly like tax, but cess has a meaning that it has to go back to the sector for its alternative development, although that has not been followed in India, but there was a big chance for that. So there were many thousand million rupees have been accumulated in that national clean energy fund. So basically, the countries had their revenue generation process. So this is a revenue for the countries.
But
So
still, but that's
government
not, but
can,
that's, but
yeah,
that's not an overall carbon tax that would then apply to natural gas and apply to oil as well, right? Because then you're going to have this
exactly.
economy wide energy
Yeah,
tax, and
yeah,
it's had no traction here in the United States, and
yeah.
I'm not optimistic that we're going to see one. But it's still the idea. I understand the idea in an economic standpoint makes a lot of sense, but in reality, it just seems to me very difficult to implement.
I don't know. I would not say difficult to implement, but as an economist, and also, I would say in 80s when I was doing my research and I was trying to see that if carbon tax is implemented, then what it means for the Indian industries, right? And then I found that, okay, so they will have their productivity loss because they depend too much on energy. And so their technology is, we call it energy biased. And that was almost the finding for many other countries. But from 2000, when we took the data and we started analyzing, we find that the industries are changing their technology so much. So they are making their energy saving technologies. And so now, if you impose a carbon tax, they have the flexibility of doing substitution among the factory inputs and the fuels, and so that they can actually internalize that. So I do not think that the days have changed. So if you look empirically, the industries are also adjusting quite a bit. So I think, I mean, with carbon tax, the money which comes as a revenue can be used for the research and development for making clean coal technology, or a cleaner technology, so fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage, or maybe, I mean, all different kind of clean technologies. I don't want to be a technology picker, but because I don't believe that one single technology can really
Sure.
dominate in the whole system. There has to be a whole portfolio of technologies. So
Right.
you need money for that. So I think from the economy, if you generate the money and you incentivize the cleaner production processes, then definitely the investors will see business in that. And so that's how you create a business, right? So a new business comes in when you create a new business environment. So from that point of view, I would say that one should see the optimism in that rather than seeing this as a negative point.
So, fair enough. What occurs to me just now is, so does the pandemic change this now? I mean, the global economy is taking a big hit. Is do you think? Well, I'll make the question: is the pandemic going to change the global energy mix in any significant way? Is this going to have any kind of longer term impact on energy markets? Any thoughts on that?
It will be very difficult to say right now because it depends how say, for example, the recovery package is in every country is invested or directed, right? So one thing is very clear, that you have to invest in such a way so that it becomes um, economically viable, so that it creates so the kind of economic income loss that has happened, that has to happen. And also I feel as an economist that you really need to invest in building some um, capital for your economy, which can have long term revenue generation for your economy. So from that point of view, anyway, investment needs to be in, say, for example, in India, it has to be in the power generation sector. So in which kind of technology this can be directed, there is a big choice to make, right? So
Sure.
that's something which can be done.
Right.
But what I feel is that in pandemic, one thing became very clear is that it's the health and hygiene, right? So which is very important. So to maintain hygiene for the countries like India, where 50% at least, I mean worldwide, right? So 50% did not have access to the hygiene because they don't have running hot water in their homes, right? So pandemic was a story. The pandemic, I mean, I would say the prescriptions about hygiene was only valid for 50% of the world population, and for 50% who doesn't have hot water, who doesn't have water, who doesn't have electricity in their home, I mean, what to talk of hygiene for them, right? So, I mean, it really brought out the real story of our injustice that we are still living with. So, if you ask me where the money needs to be spent, I would say that can we dare to create the infrastructure of electricity and water for this 50% of the world population who really needs it now? And so, can that investment, it can actually solve all the problems in one shot. But that bold decision has to be taken.
So the pandemic, I'm going to repeat back my interpretation of what you just said, is that the pandemic has only underscored this vast disparity in energy availability.
Yeah, it just clearly showed that all hygiene practices which have been told is for the 50% of the world population. And
that has access to hot water and electricity.
And when you ask them to stay home, what home they will stay? They don't have a roof. And you talk of rooftop solar for whom, right? So, I mean, these are the real questions which, I mean, this pandemic has shown us in front of us. This is actually challenging the 50% of the privileged like us, right? So who got the electricity, who never felt what it means if there is no electricity, if there is no dignified living, what does it mean? We have never experienced that. So how can we say that is the 3 bulbs for the poor will solve their electricity demand problem? Is it 3 bulbs with which we have lived ever in our life? Or so, you know, I mean, I think that's what I'm just telling, that this pandemic has shown that the development process that we have lived with so far has been for 50% of the world, and 50% has been deprived of this development. And if they have been deprived, this is their time now starts, where we really need to invest all our priority things: water, housing, and electricity. If these 3 things are provided, then the disparity is gone. And then you can think that they participate. They don't participate in the whole discourse. What is climate change? What is, I mean, health disaster? What is natural disaster? They never participate because they live between 2 binaries, you know, whether they will die out of any natural disaster or they will die out of hunger. So I mean, it's not a choice for them. So they never participate in all these discourses, and we also do not hear their voices. This pandemic has made us to hear their voices. So I think this is hard choices we have to make now. And in this 1 decade, we have to make these hard choices.
Well, so let me follow up on that, because we talked about this on in fact, in the documentary. And at one point you said we were talking about efforts by some NGOs in the developed world to limit the financing for hydrocarbon projects in the developing world, and that there were active efforts to prevent the World Bank, BlackRock, other entities, big funding organizations, to prevent them from investing in any kind of hydrocarbon projects in the developing world. And as I recall, you said that, I'm paraphrasing, but it's close. I think you said it's a crime. It's a major crime. So I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, but I mean
Yeah,
this is key though, is it not? The
yeah.
availability of capital to make this development happen has to come from the rich countries to go to the relatively poor ones. Is that not part of that investment has to come from them? No.
I mean, the current coal burning in different countries, the numbers I told you a little earlier, right? So if we look into those numbers, and if you think that you really need to provide electricity to the 50% of the underprivileged in the world. I'm not saying where, they are everywhere, right? So
Sure.
the numbers are somewhere more and somewhere less. Then why not think in terms of stopping all coal-fired plants which provides electricity to the privileged, and give the electricity to the poor with this? can
you
we can
you
we can we put
you
our hands in our hearts and ask this question? And of course, I think that those who demonstrate that there should be demonstration against coal power plant, less coal power plant should be built. I do believe in people's freedom, right to freedom of expression, and I am a believer of that. So I don't think that we should stop anyone from saying that they need to be given the freedom. But I do not see it as a problem if the investment comes to the cleaner energy and for the 50% of the deprived population. If that can happen, this is the win-win situation, right? So I do not see that as a problem, but it has to be a conscious choice to be made for whom and where we are going to build cleaner technologies, and we have to make investment. And as I said, there have been talk of carbon capture and storage. So then the investment has to come that way. And then the cost sharing needs to be done globally, right? And so the appropriate incentives need to be there for the investors. And but if
but that means international cooperation on this. I mean, it's going to be.
Of course, and you cannot avoid, because it's a global problem which we are talking about. We want to solve. If we do not talk of carbon, then it's a fragmented world. Still, they can take a fragmented decision. But if it is of carbon and which is having an impact on the global economy, health, and everything, then of course there has to be a global cooperation. Not in each and everything, but in certain things there has to be a global cooperation.
And so, well, so let me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but so are you optimistic about that? Because I mean, I go back and forth, right? Because in fact, Jason Bordoff wrote a piece recently about this, saying that the pandemic is reflective of how difficult it is to get international cooperation on anything, right? And here we have a disease that's international, but the amount of international cooperation has been, well, kind of, maybe not so good. Are you optimistic that that will happen? I mean, that we will see that kind of international cooperation that you're advocating for?
Okay, let me just say one or two more things, and then I'll answer your
Sure.
question. Right. So what I just feel is that so long the freedom of expression doesn't say that poor need, do not prescribe how much the poor need, and do not prescribe what the privilege needs, then I have a problem. So I mean, I think it has to be that how much the underprivileged really need, that has to be the priority. So this justice issue really need to come up front. So unless we address this, we are going to be going away, farther and farther away from any kind of participation or cooperation in the world, because this has shown people the hardest hit are those who doesn't have the privileges, and they are the hardest hit this time. We are talking less of them, we are talking more of ourselves, but this will come back as a backlash. So we really need to be very careful about this. Unless we have this hard talk, it will be very difficult. And if you talk of the optimism, then I would say that, if we, the privileged ones, are not optimistic, and if we lose hope, and if we do not burn our morning and the night lamps to find the solution for this injustice, who would do that? So it's not a matter of, sorry, it's not a matter of optimism or pessimism. It's our mandate. We should do it.
And the mandate, I'm going to repeat back or reflect back what I hear, how I'm hearing you, that, and I'll call it, you say justice. I mean, it's energy justice. Is that the right term, that the mandate has to be energy justice for the powerless, right? I mean, one of the things that you have 40% of the world's population, 3.3 billion people, my research, that are using less electricity than my refrigerator in my kitchen, that has to be the fundamental motivating force about bringing, well, okay, so now it's me talking about bringing those people out of the dark and into modernity. That has to be the priority.
Yeah, and the mandate comes from heart. It should not come in any international written agreement or anything. It should come from heart. And if that doesn't come, if our consciousness doesn't lead us to that, then we are no humans. So I feel that we really, really need to be asking questions to ourselves. So I think pandemic has brought us in front of us our own introspective picture, which we build within ourselves about the civilization
and about what we want that to be.
Yeah.
And that dealing with the pandemic is fundamentally a reflection of energy availability.
Self-reflection. And I always feel that it's you are asking people to stay home, and they have no electricity. They have 10 by 10 space to live, and maybe 10 people living there. I mean, what are these norms we are talking about? So I think, it's a high time that we should get the heart's call to do something for this justice.
Well, we've been talking now for close to an hour. That's beautifully put. So let me just ask you a couple of last things here. So when you look at the intellectuals around the world, when you look at people, authors doing things, others, who do you admire? Whose work do you admire in the things that we've been discussing? What is the, who do you really think is a thought leader in some of these things, or books that you're reading now that really are of interest to you?
No, there are many books which are interesting, and I'm reading many historical books also. But I'm not.
Yeah, can you give me two or three that you? I mean, even what you're reading now. Anything that give me a recommendation.
Yeah, I'm reading now Upheaval, and I really like Jared Diamond's this book. But this is a completely different book, and I'm really liking it because it gives very interesting comparisons. But also, I'm reading many books written by the Indian thought leaders, very old books. One by Swami Vivekananda, who went to in 1896, 98. At that time, he went to US to talk about, to give a lecture in Chicago, a religious parliament of religion in Chicago. So he's a very, he talked about religion, but he was an educated, English educated young person was there. So he used to talk what is his vision about India. So I'm reading those. I'm reading Gandhi's My Experimentation with Truth. I'm reading Radha Krishnan's the first president of India, his book on Gandhi. So very interesting reading, I would say, because I just wanted to refresh my mind, And I did not want to name any single, but if you tell me, I maybe among the modern days, I have not gotten anyone really to admire, because I have seen that all the development, which I have also been studying and practicing and doing, have excluded 50% of population. So it's a real time now when we all have to ask ourselves that what has gone wrong with the development process, what has been right with the development process. So if we look into the right ones, and then we can correct the wrong ones, right? So how can we get all 100% within our fold so that we all can work together? So from that point of view, I would say that I can't name any single person for admiration. Maybe he or she is in the making, or they are in the making. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm sure that humanity will not let this chance to go and to save the civilization. So we have to make our efforts and keep burning our morning and night lamps and forget about our leisure and think for the civilization and humanity at large.
I think that's a good place to stop. I think that's night. Although I will say burning the morning and night lamps. No lamps, light bulbs. We need light bulbs and LED. Oh, yeah. No lamps. Lamps, that's yesterday.
These bulbs are lamps now, right?
Right. I understand the poetic there, but I want, but I want I'm with you that is the key challenge that faces us, is this massive energy disparity that is, that we, particularly in the United States and Western countries, don't think about so much, but is very much the key challenge in Asia, South Asia, China, and obviously in India, but
Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Myanmar, and all those places. If you go, I mean, it's a huge challenge. I mean, you have to give productive energy to everybody.
Well, I completely agree we have every reason to, and we should, because it is a great challenge of our time. Well, Joyashree Roy, you've been very kind with your time, and I know it's you're 12 hours ahead in Bangkok from where I am. It's morning here, evening there, but I'm going to go ahead and close out the podcast here. Thank you all for listening to the Power Hungry podcast. I have 6 books. You can find them on the interweb. They're available on Amazon. Joyashree, if people want to find your work, you're on the website at Asia Institute of Technology. Is that right? Yes. You're easily Googleable.
Yeah, but also you can see a new platform which I have started in the pandemic, is the changeframing.space.
Okay.
So you can see what is coming out as my new thinking, and I'm trying to use the space for taking forward the new thinking.
Changeframing.space. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, all of you out there listening, look at changeframing.space. You can look at our new film. Joyashree is one of the stars of our new documentary, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. She's really a rock star and just adds some beautiful texture and comments to the film. I'm easy to find, robertbryce.com. If you want more about the film, juicethemovie.com on the web, or Juice for All on Twitter. I'm going to stop there. This has been the Power Hungry podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joyashree.
Thank you.